Hey everyone, Clio here, and today is actually the first video in a unhaul project that is coming to you in the entirety of the month of December. So I think every single week from this video onwards you will get another entry into this video series. This is actually, funnily enough, the last one in the series that I'm filming, and originally this was intended to be a 3-part series, but at this point it's actually a 5-part series. So, as you may know, one of my goals this year, and in 2021 this goal will be continuing, is to reduce the amount of unread books on my shelves. And so as a part of that project I am tackling these shelves and unhauling quite a lot of them. Also just in general, I need the space, I need to be able to buy more books, though I am intending not to kind of restrict that a little bit, but also just I want to be able to put some trinkets here and there, and I don't really have that much space for it at this point in time. And just in general, I also want to make sure that the books that are on there are either books that I haven't read or books that I'm like confident I want to reread at some point, or that I might reread at some point. So I'm definitely going to be taking a hard look at those shelves. So basically the first video, the one that you're looking at now, is going to be me going through all of the books that I read this year and the ones of which I've decided to unhaul them. Second video is going to be me going through the unread books on that shelf, unhauling the ones that I know like I no longer have an interest in, or being quite strict with that as well. But even though I was quite strict with that, there were still some books that made me hesitate. So the third one is going to look at some books that I couldn't make my mind up about, and like looking at and like doing some research into those and trying to figure out whether I wanted to keep them or not. And so the ones that I wanted to keep out of those 19, and so for those I did a try chapter tag in the 4th video, and then the 5th video is me going through those shelves again and looking at the books that I have read but then not in 2020, and once again deciding for those books, okay, which ones of these have to go and which ones won't. So today I'm going to be looking at the ones for 2020. Now this is a sort of process where the big majority of this pile was unhauled throughout the year, was unhauled at the end of each month. At the end of each month I kind of looked at like, what did I read this month, which ones of these weren't really worth it for me or weren't worth it enough for me to want to keep this book. So I already had a kind of pile growing up throughout the year, but there were some books that I added to this as I was filming the 5th video in the series. So some of these might have a small overlap in that video. I think there are some like 2 or so I think that I unhauled in the final video in the series that actually were read in 2020, so belong in this one. So there's no particular rhyme or reason to this one. I'm not going through in the order in which I actually read these books throughout the year. I'm just going to be going in the order in which they are on this pile of mine. And so to start out with, let's start out with the biggest book on here, and that would be Duck's New Report by Lucy Ellmann. I really debated about this one because I did definitely like this one. I think I gave it a 4-star rating or something like that, and I definitely think it's unique, it's worth it. It's not for everybody. It's a sort of stream of consciousness book of over 1,000 pages in which you're looking at an Ohioan housewife who's kind of giving you all of her thoughts, and throughout you start to get these snippets of the story. You get a very close look into her personality. I don't think I've ever known a character as well as I knew this character, just because I've spent 1,000 pages in her mind. And so you will see her thoughts kind of spiraling back to the same sort of things, and in that way realizing, you know, what is at the core of this person's mind, of this person's essence. And surprisingly enough, there is actually a story there as well, which kind of starts to come together towards the very end of this book. Does it merit its 1,000 pages? Maybe not, but the main reason why I'm getting rid of this is because I know I will never reread this. I will never make the effort to go through these 1,000 pages again. The only way I got through them was by listening to the audiobook as well, and so I know I'll never do it, so I'm not going to hang on to this book for that particular reason. So I laud it for what it did and for you know, the enormity of this project, but yeah, I'm afraid that I'm going to get rid of it, which is definitely a shame because this is actually a quite exclusive hardback copy, because there aren't many hardback copies of this one. It usually is available through paperback, but because this was part of a sort of like Booker Prize package, it was printed in hardback, as the other ones were also available in hardback. But yeah, it is going to whoever will be picking it up in the secondhand bookshop. I might as well tackle the Booker Prize immediately, because I am also unhauling Quichotte by Salman Rushdie, which is a Don Quixote retelling, which I really didn't get along with all that well, so no sense keeping it on my shelf, so this one is going as well. Next up we have one that's kind of like one of my biggest disappointments for the year, because I absolutely wanted to enjoy this one. And part of me is thinking that maybe I'll just keep it on a sort of like unhaul shelf in like my junk room, because it is the first book in a series, and who knows, maybe I want to continue. But then I'm also saying, like, why would I do it, as it was such a struggle to get through this book for me. And that is Mordew by Alex Phoebe, which is the first book in a fantasy series in which we're looking at Nathan, who is this young boy who grew up in the slums. His father is severely ill. His mother kind of has to go into prostitution in order to be able to get money to help the family survive. And Nathan himself is kind of going through the mud, trying to find these sort of live organisms in there and sell them for money. However, Nathan also has a secret, because he has the spark, which is a sort of like magical power within this world. And through his use of the spark, he will be sparking an interest with the master within this world. I think it had very interesting world building, and I very much like the sort of like it's very different setting from most fantasy settings. It's very like uses very creative new elements. It's unlike another fantasy story you might have read, but it also suffers a lot from like pacing, and I definitely felt like I just wasn't moving forward in this. I would read like 10 pages and feel like I just spent like hours marathoning this book. So I really wasn't all that enjoyable for me to read this one, and so sadly I'm also getting rid of it. Next up we have one that I actually also did quite enjoy, but it's one that I won't be rereading, and so it's also one that I get rid of for that reason, and that is The Year Without Summer by Guinevere Glassford. So this is a book that is all centered around an event that took place in the 18th century, I think, or the 19th century. And so that is the outburst of a volcano on Indonesia, and it only goes into the Indonesia parts very briefly throughout this book, but it's kind of very much looking at the ramifications for Europe, maybe even the US. I don't really remember all that well, but it's kind of looking at 6 different lives and the way that volcano erupting had an impact on them, because it's basically known as the Year Without Summer in Europe, because the ash cloud that resulted from that volcano had an impact on the weather, even as far as Europe, for example. So it would mean that there was basically like no summers. And it was basically close to being like winter times during the summer in Europe at that time. It was a very dark period, and it's also the time in which Mary Shelley came with the idea for Frankenstein. So one of the perspectives that we're reading from will be the perspective of Mary Shelley, for example. But we're also looking at, for example, a sort of like laborers community, a farmers community, and the way in which they struggle with the fact that, you know, their wages are very much down, but they also don't have enough food that they can grow themselves to sustain themselves, and so it's sort of like revolt that a sort of like upheaval that results from this sort of situation. And I thought it was interesting, and I definitely think that there were some perspectives in here that I found more intriguing than others, and I do definitely want to like look out for what Guinevere Glassford is kind of going to be coming out with from now on. But it almost felt like a little bit like a short story collection, where there are some pieces better than others, and so overall it stays kind of bland. And I had this with this one as well. And actually what I kind of would have preferred was a little bit more of the volcano eruption itself, because yeah, I have a fascination with volcanoes, earthquakes and all of those things, so that part for me was always super intriguing, but we really didn't get a whole lot of that, because that was really not her focus within this book. But so that actually intrigued me the most in this book almost, so that was kind of a shame for me. But so won't be hanging on to this, because it's just I will never reread this. Next up we have Tales and Poems of Edgar Allan Poe. I'm getting rid of this one because this is an edition that basically just has like random short stories by him, but it does not have, you know, the genre that he's most well known for. It doesn't have these sort of like horror, macabre, dark tales to them. There are a few in there, but like in all it's just like general stories by him, and so I was kind of bored throughout. And so if I want to dive into Edgar Allan Poe, I'm definitely not going to be rereading any of the stories in here, but maybe I would be looking for like an edition that actually has this sort of like classic style, his famous style to it. Next up, let me treat those two together, and that would be Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom. So at the beginning of this year I was kind of, you know, I wanted to dive back into fantasy a lot more, but I also wanted to dive back into YA fantasy a lot more because I knew I'd loved that genre a lot in the past, and so I wanted to kind of try the staples of YA fantasy, and this is a series that I tried for that, but that absolutely failed. The first one was still relatively fine, you know, I considered it a fun ride. I went through it. I think I read it in one of basically Brit's 24-hour readathons, and I read it in a single day. But I did kind of have to force myself to pick it up all the time that day, because I do definitely think it has its pacing problems, and where everybody's constantly raving about these characters, I thought the characters were just so-so, and I definitely didn't like the way in which Leigh Bardugo went about, you know, giving depth to these characters. You know, there was too much telling and not enough showing. It was too much just like going into their past, giving an explanation rather than having these elements to their background story coming out throughout the actions that are taking place within the story. It felt like we were just constantly like having these flashbacks to people's past lives and learning about the characters through those moments rather than really learning about the characters in the story, within the storyline of the book itself. And then the second one, I really just got so annoyed with stakes. There are no stakes to this book. It does, like with this one, it definitely became annoying to me how predictable this one was, and how she would shy away from certain like darker subject matter, because yes, it's a YA, but I'm definitely sure that certain decisions could have been made. There's this one moment in which I was kind of ready to start respecting her, in which I was like, whoa, is she going to go there? Wow, that would be such a cool sort of like consequence to look into, a sort of cool action that will completely upset the way in which that character has viewed herself and the way in which that character is placed within the team, and would kind of upset this sort of like romance dynamic that was going on in there. But she did not go there. She backed out, and I hate it when authors back out, when they when they dangle a sort of like repercussion in front of a character, when they are threatening to completely upend everything you know, and then they don't follow through on that. So yeah, from that moment onwards, this was basically lost to me, but also the entire final section of this novel I thought was so predictable that I just couldn't enjoy it. I'm sorry guys. So I still have a couple of YA fantasies that I actually purchased in 2020 on my shelves, and I will definitely still give them a go. But I think my conclusion is that I shouldn't be trying YA fantasy anymore. I clearly don't like the genre anymore, like the genre or the age group anymore. And it's actually to the extent that there are certain adult books that I just consider YA because they are doing things that I don't like, that YA does a lot. So yeah, I know that, and definitely don't get me wrong, you are completely valid in liking YA fantasy. I loved it for a very long time, but everything that I now enjoy in a story, I don't find in YA fantasy. And that's not to say that there aren't any YA fantasies out there who do have those elements and that I'm just not finding them. I'm just not going to go through the effort of trying to find them anymore, because every single time that I go into a YA fantasy that a lot of people are liking, and so that I think like, okay, maybe that's maybe I need to try YA fantasy that people don't like. Maybe that will be the YA fantasy that I like. But in any case, I think like there's so much adult fantasy that I still want to read that I don't have the time for, so let me just focus on adult fantasy, where I am more likely to find the things that I like than I am in YA fantasy. So these two, I'm sorry guys, somebody will be extremely happy that they can find them in the secondhand bookshop. Next up, this is a book that I DNF'd, which is a very rare occasion, I almost never DNF books, so it's extremely rare for me to do so, and that is Notes from a Small Island by Bill Bryson, which, yeah, I didn't see the point of it in parts, because so this is a sort of goodbye to Britain. So Bill Bryson is American, but he spent a lot of his time in living and working in the UK, and so this is kind of his farewell tour of the United Kingdom. But the places that he was going through, in the part at least that I got to, like, weren't all that interesting necessarily, or if they were like interesting places, or, you know, like standard touristy places, he wasn't going to those sort of like main attractions, and the places he was going to weren't necessarily all that more interesting in that sense. So that was part of something that I didn't really understand, like, okay, why is he going here or there? Like, sometimes it was related to some personal story, or like a friend of his lived there, or things like that, but it really didn't have enough of a hook for your average reader, in my opinion, in that sense, to kind of make me want to continue reading in it. And it just had so much of a negative mindset to it, you know. There was just so much grumbling and complaining to the narrative voice, to Bill Bryson's storytelling in this one, that I couldn't do it. And I think it's just this one, because I have read another book by him, A Walk in the Woods, which I absolutely enjoyed. So either I was in a mindset to enjoy grumbling and complaining books at that point, or it just had a little bit more of a interesting you know, subject matter to grab me into it. But so with this one I just couldn't do it. And then I checked out some reviews online, which either were very positive about the book and didn't mention anything about like the complaining or about the fact like, why are you choosing these places, or they would be like negative, and they were actually mentioning a part of the book that I hadn't gotten to yet. So I just decided, you know what, this isn't going to change, this isn't going to get better, and so let's just stop it right now. And similarly, I then also decided to get rid of Made in America by Bill Bryson, which is a non-fiction by him that I tried to read a couple of years ago, but I really couldn't get into. And so I now decided that, you know what, rather than say that you maybe weren't in the right mindset to read it at that time, let's just decide that not every Bill Bryson is for us, and let's just get rid of this one. So this is a book that's kind of looking into the way that British English and American English differ, and how that kind of came about. But I kind of read the first parts of this, and it was just, you know, I was expecting Bill Bryson to make this dry subject matter interesting, but at least at the very first chapters of this, that really didn't seem to happen. And so I decided that, you know, I'm not interested enough to read this one. Next up, we have a book that I was actually gifted for free. So in Belgium and the Netherlands, there's a book week every single year, and during book week, if you buy a book, then you get the sort of free book week gift, which is a small novella. It's almost always bad quality, let me say. I think I've read a few and I've enjoyed one or so, but I'm always feeling like they don't really work as short stories, or like you know, they're just not for me. Whereas I do enjoy short stories, and I think short stories could be great. It's a great concept. However, I feel like the persons who are made to write this book aren't as invested, aren't excited about writing this one, and in this case particularly I'm very annoyed with this one. So this is Leona and Juliet by Annette van der Zijl, and this is a book about a white protagonist who falls in love with a black slave. So you can already imagine that it's going to be complex subject matter that merits a lot of nuance for you to be able to fall in line with this romance, because it's definitely going to try and sell it as a romance, which was clear from reading this little story. So at first I was kind of thinking, that's going to be looking at the complexities of that relationship, but how can it do that in like 90 pages, not even in like 70 pages? But then it also became clear that it's kind of trying to sell this as a real actual love story, but how are you going to tackle that within 70 pages? And the reality is that it isn't meant to be tackled in 70 pages. This is basically just a study, a summary of the story that she will then use to build a bigger book about the entire subject. But so that also means that it basically just read like a non-fiction, like a biography, and a biography of 70 pages, which, You know, I haven't actually read long biographies, but I would either expect myself to enjoy such a long biography that really goes into depth and really leaves room for every part of the story of the person's life, or a short article, but not a 70-page story about them. And it also meant that there was just like 3 pages or something that were written in a sort of like fictionalized style, which I liked, and all the rest was in this boring sort of like summary overview style that just made it difficult to get through. This is only 70 pages, so it was such an extremely slow moving story. And yeah, I just don't think they should have come out with it. They should have known that, you know, first of all, this isn't great publicity for her book, I think, because it's so difficult to read through it. But also, this is a subject matter that you cannot treat lightly, and I would have definitely hoped that Book Week, the organization behind the Book Week gift itself, would have just decided that they wouldn't go there, that they wouldn't allow something like this to be published in a sort of like short story format. But yeah, it's there. I didn't like it. It's going. Next up, another short one that didn't work for me is The Body Artist by Don DeLillo. This is weird, and I don't fully understand what happened in it, but I was also bored throughout the majority of it. Basically, we are following an artist who's like a body contortionist, and it's kind of dealing with how she transforms through contortionism, but she's also like seeing somebody or hearing somebody, and it's about her dealing with grief. But you know, I like weird stories, but this one was just boring, and I was just very much lost throughout the majority of it, so didn't work for me. Next up, one that you will see a lot of people probably also praise a lot, but I just couldn't get on with this one, and that is The Binding by Bridget Collins. So she actually has a new book out, The Betrayals, I think, which also has such a beautiful cover like The Binding, but I loved a part of this. So this is a story told in 3 parts, and we are sold to this story through the idea that there's a sort of bookbinding skill that takes away people's memory. So if you have a certain memory in your past that you just cannot process, you cannot deal with, you cannot continue on with life that way, then you will go to a binder and they will take your memories away. As a result, they're seen as like they're seen in a very negative light, and there's very much a sort of like distancing between society and the binders. And so that's kind of the hook. This is what you're told going into this book. But so the first part, the entire first part, is basically about this boy who kind of gets sick and who is then whisked away to go and see the binder and become the binder's apprentice. And like the very first part is all about him finding out what binding is and figuring out that he himself has actually been bound at some point, which you're told in the back cover of this book. So the first like 140 pages or whatever, how long it is, you are basically just catching up to the summary at the back of this book. And then you get into the story within the story, so you get into him actually reading his binding, reading the story that he was trying to suppress, which is the part that I absolutely loved, and which is also the part that I hate, in the sense that it should have been sold in that way. You know, the second part of this book is, so the story within the story deals with a romance story between him and another boy that entered into the neighborhood. This should have been sold as a male-male romance, because we don't have enough LGBTQIA+ representation to start with. This is a massive book coming out that a lot of people won't know is LGBTQ, and it's missing a big chunk of its audience, and I think that part was beautiful. It worked so well. But then we go back into the like present day story time, and we go back into reality. Now our protagonist Alice is aware of everything that has happened, and we're going to be rolling along with that. But that also didn't really work that well for me, because there's a sort of like I cannot go into why I don't like that. That's spoiler territory. But so I only liked the second part of this book in the end. What I liked and what I thought I was getting with this book was going to be looking at, you know, the way in which we're manipulating the art of binding, and you know, I definitely get that a little bit in that third part, where we're seeing characters who are kind of doing bad things to people and then making sure that those people are bound afterwards so that they don't remember, and so that these things can be done to them over and over again. So kind of looking at the way that people are abusing this skill. So that was definitely something interesting, though I also didn't think it was delved into enough to make this a compelling read for me. Will I try something else by Bridget Collins? Maybe, you know, there was enough potential in here, and as I said, I love that second part, so if her new book is more like that second part, I will definitely enjoy it. So I will definitely still try it out, probably, The Betrayals by Bridget Collins, but yeah, I'm not entirely sure. You know, this one just felt like two different books to me, and it just felt like it was marketed in the wrong way, which of course is not Bridget Collins' fault, but you know, so it just made me angry reading it for those reasons. Next up we have a book by an author I actually have a favorite book by, and that is Italo Calvino. So this is Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino. I absolutely loved his If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. And Invisible Cities is also experimental writing, but it's different and it was kind of a lot more boring. So it's basically Marco Polo who is in the service of a Chinese ruler, and he goes to all of these sort of like cities of that empire, and he describes those cities to the ruler, but it's really boring. I think there's probably a lot more to it that I'm just not getting out of this book. But so yeah, I just really didn't enjoy it. It has a sort of structure as well where it's like it's counting, it does something with like the chapter titles and things like that, but it all went way over my head, and I didn't really grab onto that, or I didn't really see what he was doing with that myself. So maybe I should actually just read some like introductions into this story or some works about this story, but you know, I didn't enjoy this one, so I'm also not hanging on to it. Next up, this might be a little bit of a shocker, I'm getting rid of King Lear by William Shakespeare. So I wanted to read more Shakespeare, so I started with King Lear, but it's really just not for me. I really cannot follow Shakespearean English. I'm really just totally lost, and you know, I know if you take your time with it, I'd probably get a lot out of it if I were to like read all of the notes and things like that, but I think I'll just accept the fact that the only way that I'm actually going to be able to enjoy Shakespeare is if I watch like actual play renditions of his stories, or you know, the movie adaptations, but I prefer to have them be a little bit more like traditional play versions of it, because I have had good experiences with those in the past, but as a text it just really doesn't work for me, and I'm not willing to put in that effort to try and make it worth something for me, because I'm not interested enough in it, you know. You know, I took a Shakespeare class only once in like summer school, and I was bored throughout, and we actually did King Lear, I think, so maybe King Lear just isn't a good one for me, but in any case, I don't think like it's just me wanting to be more profound, wanting to be more of a like intellectual than I actually am, because this is totally lost on me. Another one that was totally lost on me was Dear Friend from My Life, I Write to You in Your Life by Yoon Lee. I really wanted to like this one, and I probably would have actually enjoyed it more if I knew it was an essay collection, but I just was kind of like, what's the link between all of these stories? I don't understand, and you know, I've actually forgotten everything about this at this point, but I know that I felt like my eyes were reading the words, but my brain wasn't processing them. So yeah, I have read another book by Yoon Lee in the meantime, but it really wasn't a great read for me neither, that one, so I just think that her writing style sadly isn't for me. And then the final one on this list that I'm getting rid of this year is Life for Sale by Yukio Mishima. So I had an okay time with this. I enjoyed this relatively well. I think it's probably like a 3.5 star rating or something, but it's also not something that I'm going to be rereading. It is kind of, so it's Japanese literature, and it kind of falls into like weird Murakami vibes, but it is extremely weird, and it doesn't have that sort of, you know, there's just an atmosphere to Murakami's works that I love more than I actually love this sort of like weird elements to his stories. I think what really draws me to a Murakami book is a sort of atmosphere, the feeling you get when reading a book like that, which I know is all very vague and just I cannot describe it myself, you know. There's just something to these stories, sort of like dreamlike, like a dreamlike atmosphere that's there. I kind of would easily consider them to be like to be made into like a film noir version, for example. That's kind of the same aesthetic I feel in terms of emotion with Murakami, which is all even more vague, but I cannot put it into words. But so there's something about Murakami's writing that just feels like coming home in a way, that feels, every time you read a Murakami, it's like, oh yeah, you get that feeling again. And whereas this one has the weirdness that Murakami has, it doesn't have some sort of like emotional or like atmospheric element to it that lifted it to another level. And so without that element, it seems that I don't necessarily like the weirdness of this book, you know. It was just weird and nonsensical, and I didn't really see the point of it necessarily. I enjoyed it just fine. It was an okay story and it moved along in interesting ways, and you wanted to figure out what was going to happen, but it didn't have that sort of sense of profoundness, that sense of there being something more behind the weirdness that we were shown. So yeah, I ended up just liking it, and that was just about it. So these are all the books that I'm getting rid of that I read in 2020. Obviously, since at this point in time I've read 110 books, obviously there are also quite a lot of books that I'm unhauling since I'm being strict about it. But yeah, in terms of like my overall reading year so far, I definitely have been enjoying my reading a lot. And as you have noticed throughout this video, there are definitely also some books in here that I did enjoy that I'm also getting rid of. But so yeah, I hope you aren't too shocked about some of these books. Definitely do let me know down below if you have contrasting opinions to mine for some of these, or of course if you agree with me about some of these. I hope I haven't like put you off of reading some of these if they were on your TBR, but you know, just know that maybe there's some danger there, and that if you're not enjoying yourself, maybe back out. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and see you guys for the next one. Bye!